Why did early humans settle in Brazil? Why this specific corner of the world, a vast, semi-arid interior at the far end of a continent, and not somewhere closer to wherever their journey began? Think of South America like the bottom floor of a building. The standard story says humans entered through the front door in Alaska, took the elevator down through North America, and only reached the ground floor, Brazil, last. Maybe 13,000 years ago, maybe a little earlier, but last. That was the textbook version for most of the 20th century. It was tidy. It fit the timeline. It had the kind of clean logic that a theory needs to survive. But the evidence coming out of northeast Brazil tells a different story. Humans were on that bottom floor far earlier than the elevator theory allows, which means either the timeline is wrong, or there was another entrance nobody mapped, or both. In this video, I will show you the evidence. The rock shelters carved into sandstone cliffs in the Caatinga Desert. The charcoal from fires that burned long before anyone was supposed to be there. The stone tools that belong to no North American tradition. And thousands of paintings left on the walls of shelters, untouched for tens of thousands of years. I will also show you one woman, found buried under more than 12 meters of mineral deposits in a cave in Minas Gerais, whose bones became the most debated human remains ever found in the Americas. Her story alone rewrote the field twice. First, the establishment was wrong about when. Then it was wrong about who. Understanding how both of those mistakes happened is the key to understanding why early humans settled in Brazil and what the evidence is still trying to tell us. To understand where this story gets complicated, you need to understand what the field was working from and why it was so certain for so long. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model was called Clovis First. The name comes from Clovis, New Mexico, where in the late 1920s and early 1930s, archaeologists digging in a dry stream bed found distinctive stone spear points buried alongside mammoth bones. The dates came back to around 13,000 years ago. When similar tools appeared across North America at roughly the same time, a framework locked in. The story went like this. During the last ice age, a broad stretch of land called Beringia connected Siberia to Alaska. Small groups of people crossed it, following animal herds east into a new continent. As the ice sheets melted, a corridor opened between two massive glaciers along what is now the eastern edge of the Canadian Rockies. Through that corridor, people moved south and spread across two continents. Clovis people were first. Everything else came after. Under that model, Brazil would have been one of the last places on Earth to be settled, the final room in a very large building. Nobody had a reason to think humans arrived there early. That is the world the next discovery walked into. In 1973, in the Piauí state of northeast Brazil, a site was found that would sit at the center of one of the most heated debates in American archaeology for the next 5 decades. It was called Boqueirão de Pedra Furada, the ravine of the pierced rock, a rock shelter tucked under a 150-meter sandstone cliff in what is now Serra da Capivara National Park. The archaeologist who defined the next phase of work there was Nide Guidon, a French-Brazilian researcher. She published her first major findings in the journal Nature in 1986. What she found was not supposed to exist. Under carefully excavated, undisturbed layers, her team found charcoal from ancient fires and stone tools. Over 60 datable levels in the earth, each sealed beneath the layer above it. And the dates those samples returned pushed back into territory the Clovis First model said was impossible. some readings at 30,000 years before present, some at 40,000, a few pointing toward 50,000. Published in one of the world's leading scientific journals, the findings met immediate and forceful resistance from the North American archaeological community. We will come back to that resistance. But first, consider why humans would have come to northeast Brazil in the first place. The settlement is not random. There is an environmental logic to it. The region where Serra da Capivara sits runs along the São Francisco River, the great spine of northeast Brazil, a river that flows year-round through an otherwise harsh, semi-arid landscape called the Caatinga. Walter Neves, an anthropologist at the University of São Paulo, who has spent decades working on early Brazilian prehistory, has argued that the São Francisco was likely one of the main corridors people used moving into the continental interior. The logic is simple. You are a small group moving through land you have never seen before. You follow what you need. You follow animals. You follow water. The São Francisco gave you water even when everything around it dried out. Archaeological sites across Brazil cluster along major rivers for exactly this reason. The rock shelters at Serra da Capivara offered something the open land could not: protection. Natural overhangs above you, walls at your back, a clear view of the terrain ahead, shade in a climate where the heat could kill. For a small group of hunter-gatherers moving through an unfamiliar continent, this was exactly the kind of place you stopped and stayed. And they did more than stay. They painted. Over 1,300 archaeological sites have been documented inside Serra da Capivara National Park. Hundreds of rock shelters contain paintings, not scattered marks, but deliberate scenes. Humans hunting, dancing, giving birth, interacting with animals that no longer exist. Some of the ochre red images depict species that went extinct during the Pleistocene, which would mean, if the paintings were made while those animals were alive, that some of the artists were in Brazil tens of thousands of years ago. Some of the paintings have been dated to more than 25,000 years before present using light-based dating methods and radiocarbon. Not all of those dates are accepted without question. Dating rock art is technically difficult, and some readings carry wide uncertainty ranges. But the paintings themselves are not in dispute. In 1991, UNESCO designated Serra da Capivara a World Heritage Site, calling it an outstanding testimony to one of the oldest human communities in South America. The question is not whether people were here. The question is how long ago they arrived and how they got there. That question was about to get a great deal more complicated. In 1975, a joint French-Brazilian expedition led by archaeologist Annette Laming-Empereur was working at a different site, Lapa Vermelha 4, the Red Cave, near Belo Horizonte in the state of Minas Gerais, roughly 1,500 kilometers south of Serra da Capivara. Under more than 12 meters of mineral deposits, the team found a partial skeleton. The remains of a young woman, around 20 years old, when she died. No other human remains nearby, just her bones, some scattered stone tools, and the weight of thousands of years pressing down from above. Her name became Luzia. Radiocarbon dating placed her at around 11,500 years old, making her one of the oldest human skeletons ever found in the Americas at the time of discovery. She sat in storage at Brazil's National Museum for nearly 2 decades before the field was ready for what she was about to reveal. In the 1990s, Walter Neves of the University of São Paulo studied her skull in detail. What he found did not fit the model. He was not looking for a controversy. He was looking at bone measurements, but the measurements kept pointing somewhere unexpected. Lucia's skull did not look like the skulls of later Native Americans. The skulls that were expected from people believed to have crossed Beringia from Northeast Asia tended to be rounder, with flatter faces and prominent cheekbones. Lucia's skull was different. It was narrow and long. Her face projected forward. She had wide nostrils and low eye sockets. To physical anthropologists at the time, trained to read skull shapes as geographic indicators, those features did not point to Northeast Asia. They pointed somewhere else entirely, to Africa, to Australia, to populations whose skull shapes matched those of older, more generalized human groups that had spread out of Africa along the southern coast of Asia long before the ancestors of Native Americans ever crossed Beringia. In 1998, Richard Neve, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Manchester known for reconstructing ancient faces, was commissioned to rebuild Lucia's face for a BBC television documentary. The reconstruction was shown publicly in 1999. The face that emerged had strongly African and Australo-Melanesian features. It was displayed at Brazil's National Museum, published in scientific journals and international newspapers. The headline the popular press landed on was direct. The first Brazilian was African. The theory that built around this finding was serious. In 2005, Neves published a formal study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examining 81 skulls from the Lagoa Santa region. His conclusion: the earliest South Americans showed a pattern consistent with Australo-Melanesian ancestry, distinct from the later populations tied to Beringia. The implication was a first wave of people who reached the Americas before the Beringia crossing, traveled an entire hemisphere south, and left descendants in Brazil before being replaced by a wave from the north. For almost 20 years, that theory shaped how the field understood who the first South Americans were. Then came November 2018. Two studies involving researchers from institutions across 8 countries were published simultaneously on November 8th. One study was led by Cosimo Pasc and colleagues in the Journal Cell, and a companion study was led by Eski Willerslev's team in the journal Science. The Cell paper, led by teams from Harvard Medical School, the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, and the University of Sao Paulo, analyzed genome-wide ancient DNA from 49 individuals across 4 geographic regions in Central and South America. The study had 72 authors in total. The results were unambiguous. Lucia and the Lagoa Santa people were genetically entirely Amerindian. There was no significant genetic connection to Africa. There was no significant genetic connection to Australia. The skull shape that had anchored a competing migration theory for nearly 20 years turned out to be an unreliable guide to ancestry. Andre Strauss of the Max Planck Institute, who coordinated the Brazilian part of the study, said it directly. The genetic results show categorically that there was no significant connection between the Lagoa Santa people and groups from Africa or Australia. The first facial reconstruction of Lucia was wrong, built on a flawed assumption that skull shape reliably tells you where someone came from. DNA proved it does not. A new reconstruction was commissioned, this time from genetic data rather than skull shape alone. The updated Lucia looks broadly Amerindian. The establishment was wrong twice, first about when, then about who. And it was DNA that corrected the second mistake. The 2018 DNA result did not arrive on its own. It was one piece of a set of independent lines of evidence, each pointing the same direction. In September 2023, a team led by Christine Hatte of France's Commissariat, et l'Énergie Atomique, presented findings at the second Latin American Radiocarbon Conference in Mexico City. They reviewed more than 100 radiocarbon and OSL dates. OSL, optically stimulated luminescence, measures how long mineral grains like quartz and feldspar have been buried and shielded from light. Unlike radiocarbon, it does not depend on organic material and cannot be contaminated the same way. It dates the sediment directly. When you apply both methods independently, and they converge on the same answer across 50 archaeological layers at 8 sites, that pattern is significant. Hadi's team found evidence of nearly continuous human presence in the Serra da Capivara region over the last 40,000 years. The debate continues, but it is no longer one-sided. The tools found at Pedra Ferrada represent a completely separate technological tradition from the Clovis toolkit found in North America. Clovis tools are recognizable, thin, fluted spear points made with a specific technique. The tools at Serra da Capivara do not use that technology. They are simpler, heavier, made a different way entirely. A separate tradition implies a separate origin, a separate timing, or both. Monte Verde in southern Chile was excavated by Tom Dillahay in the 1970s. For 2 decades, the mainstream community resisted his dates. Then in 1997, a delegation of senior archaeologists visited the site, studied the layers, reviewed the evidence, and accepted them. The main occupation layer, Monte Verde II, is dated to approximately 14,500 years before present. That date is now settled. Monte Verde sits near the southern tip of South America, roughly 15,000 kilometers by land from Alaska. For humans to have been there 14,500 years ago, they had to have entered and moved south well before that arrival. The interior, ice-free corridor through Canada, was only just opening at that same time. Most researchers conclude the more plausible route was the Pacific coastline, people moving south along the coast, following the kelp forest ecosystem that provided food and direction. That route, sometimes called the Kelp Highway, explains why the oldest South American sites are not clustered in the north but scattered along the Pacific coast and interior, which fits with people arriving along the shore and then moving inland. The 2024 study from central Brazil by Schirado and colleagues was published in the Journal of Human Anthropological Sciences on early human remains from Gruta Azul, the Blue Cave, a karst cave in the Brazilian interior. Using 2 independent dating methods, they confirmed human presence older than 10,000 years before present. The study identified Serra da Capivara and the Paraguacu River Valley, both in the São Francisco River Basin, as the 2 earliest reliably dated evidence zones in the entire country. 2 independent research teams, 2 independent regions, both pointing to the same river basin. The one most often overlooked is Lapa do Santo, the Holy Cave, in the Lagoa Santa region of Minas Gerais. Andre Strauss and colleagues documented structured ritual burials dated to 10,000 to 8,000 years before present, published in the journal Antiquity in 2016. These included a ritualized decapitation burial, a skull with cut marks on the jaw and neck vertebrae, with 2 severed hands carefully arranged over the face. There were no conventional grave goods, no monuments. The body itself was the ritual. The arrangement was not accidental. You do not develop complex burial rituals the week you arrive somewhere. You develop them across generations of living in the same place. The people at Lapa do Santo had been in the Lagoa Santa region long enough for all of that to exist. Their presence at 10,000 years before present points to occupation considerably earlier than that. Now consider why the Serra da Capivara record survived at all, because the answer matters. 3 specific things combine to protect evidence here that would have disappeared almost anywhere else on Earth. The first is the sandstone. The overhanging cliffs shielded the painted walls from direct rain. The sheltered environment slowed the temperature swings and humidity cycles that decay organic material. Rock art at more exposed sites over the same period is simply gone. The sandstone acted as a natural archive. The second is the Caatinga climate. The semi-arid landscape preserves organic material in a way that wet tropical environments cannot. Charcoal that would break down within centuries in a humid rainforest can survive tens of thousands of years in a dry rock shelter. Bone that would dissolve in acidic forest soils survives in the alkaline deposits of a cave. The same harsh climate that made the region hard to live in preserved the proof of who had lived there. Caatinga preserved the record. The third is the São Francisco River. Because it provided reliable water in a landscape that dried out seasonally, it drew people back to the same locations repeatedly across thousands of years. They did not use a rock shelter once and move on. They came back. Each visit left evidence. Layer on top of layer, generation on top of generation, until the record accumulated like the rings of a tree. Now consider where Lucia was found. Not on the coast. Not near any obvious northern entry point. She was deep in the interior highlands of Minas Gerais at 11,500 years before present, 1,500 kilometers from any coastal margin. Under any model where people entered from the north and moved south, the earliest remains should cluster near the entry point. For Lucia to be there at that time, people had to have been living in interior Brazil for a significant period before she was born. She was not a pioneer. She was a member of an established community in a landscape her people already knew. There is one more layer to this picture. Research drawing on multiple paleoclimate studies covering northeast Brazil has shown that during the last glacial period, the interior of the region was not a static desert. It cycled. Open vegetation dominated, but periodic wetter intervals expanded the available resources. More game, more plant food, more reason to stay. The Caatinga was not always hostile. At the right moment in a climate cycle, it could support people well. The environment did not just preserve the evidence. It gave people a reason to keep coming back. The 2018 cell study is the fulcrum of this entire story, but not only because it corrected Lucia's facial reconstruction. The study found that the Lagoa Santa people, including Lucia, descended entirely from the same Siberian ancestral population that gave rise to all Native Americans. The skull differences that had driven a separate migration theory for 20 years were real, but they reflected normal variation within the Amerindian population, not a completely different ancestry from another continent. There was, however, a complication. The companion science paper led by Willerslev's team examined DNA from remains from Lagoa Santa dated 10,400 years ago and found something unexpected, a faint genetic signal that appears Australasian in origin. It is absent from older genomes tested elsewhere in the Americas and from all more northerly populations. The researchers were explicit. It does not confirm a separate migration from Australia. Its origin is not yet understood, but it is real, and it does not fit a simple, single migration model. Something is there. Science has not yet explained it. But the deeper problem in this part of the story is not the Australasian signal. It is what happened to Lucia's people. Around 9,000 years ago, the genetic signature of the Lagoa Santa population disappears from the archaeological record. It is replaced by a different population with a different genetic profile. Every living Amerindian today descends from that replacement population, Lucia's people left no known modern descendants. Andre Strauss stated it plainly in 2018, "We do not yet know why the genetic stock of the Lagoa Santa people disappeared." These were people who had been in the Lagoa Santa region for thousands of years. They built ceremonial burial sites. They developed complex rituals. They painted walls across northeast Brazil. They knew this landscape the way only generations of living somewhere produces. And then, around 9,000 years ago, they are gone from the record, replaced entirely. Whether pushed out, absorbed into an incoming population, or lost to something we have not yet identified, the answer is not yet in the evidence. Lucia herself nearly joined them in permanent loss. In September 2018, the same month the DNA paper was being finalized, the National Museum of Brazil in Rio de Janeiro caught fire. The blaze destroyed more than 90% of the museum's 20 million specimens. Lucia's remains were inside. Fragments of her skull were recovered from the rubble. Students at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro have been using three-dimensional printing to reconstruct what the fire destroyed. The work continues. The story is not closed. The most persistent challenge to Serra da Capivara has lasted more than 30 years. The argument is this: what Guidon identified as stone tools may simply be naturally broken rocks, fractured by rockfall, heat, or seasonal floods, not shaped by human hands at all. And the charcoal she used to date the early layers may be from natural fires in the Caatinga, not human ones. Natural fires in semi-arid landscapes are common. Charcoal from those fires can drift into archaeological layers without any human ever being present. At the end of 1993, a team that included David Meltzer, James Adavasio, and Tom Dillahay visited the site at the invitation of the Pedra Furada team. Their published critique, released in the journal Antiquity in 1994, concluded the evidence did not meet the standard required to confirm pre-Clovis human presence. The tools were unconvincing. The charcoal could be explained without humans. That critique has not been fully answered to the satisfaction of the mainstream North American archaeological community. What has changed is the weight of evidence beneath the debate. The 2023 Hathi review did not rely on single-site charcoal dates. It applied two independent dating methods across 50 layers at 8 sites. One contaminated layer can produce a false result. A convergent pattern across 50 layers at 8 sites is a much harder thing to explain away. The debate continues, but the field is no longer where it was in 1994. The second objection returns to Lucia. Walter Neves was a rigorous scientist working with a genuine dataset of 81 skulls. His measurements were real. The differences he documented were real. The 2018 DNA study answered this directly. Skull shape is not a reliable guide to where someone came from. The Australasian signal in some Lagoa Santa genomes is real, but unexplained. It does not support the pre-Beringia migration hypothesis, but it confirms the full story is not yet written. The third objection is the most methodologically careful. A 2019 review by Dias and colleagues analyzed 277 dated archaeological materials from 90 prehistoric sites across Brazil, deliberately excluding Serra da Capivara's most contested dates. The oldest reliable dates from what remained cluster between 15,500 and 12,800 years before present, which fits reasonably with people moving south through North America after Clovis. Monte Verde II in Chile is accepted at 14,500 years before present. If humans were already at the southern tip of South America then, they had to have entered the continent and moved south well before that, most likely through a coastal route, since the interior ice-free corridor was only just opening at that same time. The conservative Brazilian timeline is very difficult to hold together against that backdrop. The conservative reading does not disprove early occupation of Brazil. It reflects genuine difficulty in dating deeply buried sites and the care that science requires when individual sites carry contested results. But the weight of the continental evidence is moving in a specific direction, and it is getting harder to ignore. The Clovis First model is dead. The field accepted that when Monteverde's dates held up in 1997, the question is no longer whether humans were in South America before 13,000 years ago. That question was answered. The question now is how early, by what route, and how many separate arrivals there were. Brazil was not settled last. It was settled by people who had already crossed an entire continent, possibly along the Pacific coast, possibly through a route we have not yet fully mapped, and who were drawn to the interior highlands and river valleys of northeast Brazil by the same things that have always drawn humans to specific places: shelter, water, and game. The evidence that humans were there earlier than the standard timeline allows has grown more credible with every decade of research, not less. The 2023 dating review, the 2024 findings from Central Brazil, the accepted Monteverde dates, and the DNA results from 2018 have collectively shifted the field. Lucia's bones, partially recovered from a fire that destroyed the building meant to protect them, are still being studied. The paintings at Serra da Capivara, some of the oldest surviving human art anywhere on Earth, are still being dated. The Lagoa Santa people, who left no modern descendants, are still being understood. The story is not complete. Science moves by challenging what everyone agreed on yesterday. Each challenge gets us a little closer to what is actually true. And the pre-Columbian Americas have more to reveal than the standard model ever imagined. Given everything the evidence suggests, do you think the first humans to reach Brazil came through the Beringia land bridge and moved south? Or is there another route the archaeology is pointing toward? Serra da Capivara contains over 1,300 individual archaeological sites. If you had access to one of those sites and could ask it one question, what would you want to know about the people who painted those walls? Leave your answers in the comments. Check out the video on screen for more lost evidence.